Breaking news tonight, and the Supreme Court has just delivered a stunning 9-0 unanimous ruling that is sending shockwaves through every level of government, every state legislature, and every courthouse in America. The entire country is scrambling right now to understand what just happened, what it means, and how it's going to reshape the legal and political landscape for years to come. When the Supreme Court speaks unanimously on major constitutional questions, you're witnessing history being made in real time. A 9-0 ruling is extraordinarily rare, especially on issues involving constitutional rights where the court typically divides along ideological lines. But when all 9 justices, from the most conservative to the most liberal, agree on a fundamental principle, it sends an unmistakable message that transcends politics, that cuts through partisan divides, and that establishes constitutional boundaries that cannot be ignored, evaded, or challenged. This is a moment that will be remembered and studied for decades, a decision that law students will read, that lawyers will cite, and that judges will apply in countless future cases. The implications of this ruling extend far beyond the specific law or regulation that was struck down. This decision affects every American regardless of political affiliation, regardless of where you live, and regardless of how you feel about the underlying issue. This isn't just about law, it's about power, about the relationship between citizens and government, about the limits that the Constitution places on what lawmakers and bureaucrats can do, and about the fundamental rights that cannot be compromised no matter how popular or well-intentioned the restrictions might be. Stay with me, because I'm going to break down exactly what the court ruled, why the 9-0 vote changes everything, what the immediate nationwide fallout looks like, and what comes next in this constitutional earthquake. Let me explain what the court actually ruled, because understanding the decision in simple, powerful terms is essential to grasping its magnitude. The Supreme Court confronted a major constitutional issue at the intersection of individual rights and government power. At stake was whether the government, whether federal, state, or local, could impose certain restrictions, regulations, or requirements that burdened the exercise of constitutional rights. The court struck down the regulatory framework decisively, finding that it violated the Constitution in ways that all 9 justices recognized. The reasoning behind this unanimous decision centered on several fundamental principles. First, the court found that there was no valid historical tradition supporting the type of restriction the government was defending. The justices applied rigorous historical analysis, examining laws and practices from the founding era, the 19th century, and the early 20th century, and concluded that the government failed to demonstrate that this kind of regulation has any precedent in American legal tradition. Second, the court emphasized that the restriction violated the plain text of the Constitution. The justices returned to first principles, examining what the constitutional language actually says and what it was understood to mean when it was ratified, and they found that the government's interpretation stretched that text beyond recognition. Third, the court identified the restriction as government overreach, an attempt by officials to exercise power that the Constitution simply doesn't grant them. The tone of the justices in this decision was firm, united, and uncompromising. There was no hedging, no suggestion that the issue was close, and no indication that reasonable minds could differ. The court made crystal clear that this restriction crossed constitutional lines that are bright and definitive. This is not a narrow ruling that applies only to one specific set of facts or one particular jurisdiction. This is a full constitutional reset that establishes principles governing how government power can and cannot be exercised when fundamental rights are at stake. Now let's talk about why a 9-0 vote changes everything and why the unanimity of this decision makes it uniquely powerful. In recent years, we've become accustomed to seeing the Supreme Court divide 5-4 or 6-3 on major constitutional cases, with clear ideological splits and passionate dissent. But when liberal justices and conservative justices all agree on a constitutional principle, it signals something profoundly important. It's extraordinarily rare for the court to reach unanimity on major constitutional cases, and when it happens, it tells you that the legal question wasn't even close. A 9-0 ruling crushes future challenges to the decision because there's no dissenting opinion to cite, no alternative reasoning to cling to, and no argument that the outcome was driven by a narrow ideological majority. Lower courts must comply with this decision immediately and without equivocation. They cannot distinguish it on technical grounds, they cannot interpret it narrowly to preserve aspects of the struck-down framework, and they cannot wait to see if the court's composition changes and the precedent gets reversed. States cannot claim that there are legitimate differences in how the Constitution should be interpreted or that their specific regulations are somehow different enough to survive scrutiny. The unanimity removes all those escape hatches. Federal agencies that were defending or implementing the struck-down regulatory scheme lose all legal cover. They cannot argue that their interpretation was reasonable or that courts should defer to their expertise. When all 9 justices say the government was wrong, agencies have no choice but to comply. The difference between a split ruling and a unanimous one is profound. A 5-4 decision can be characterized as partisan, narrow, or potentially reversible. A 9-0 decision is none of those things. It's definitive, it's enduring, and it commands respect and compliance across the entire legal system. This isn't a debate where reasonable people can disagree. This is a constitutional declaration that establishes clear boundaries and leaves no room for argument. Let's examine the immediate nationwide fallout, because the consequences of this decision are already creating chaos and forcing rapid adjustments across the country. The ruling detonated a legal bomb that's affecting state laws, ongoing litigation, and government operations in all 50 states simultaneously. State laws that were based on the same logic or legal framework as the restriction the Supreme Court just struck down are now frozen in legal limbo. Legislatures and governors are scrambling to figure out which laws remain enforceable and which are now presumptively unconstitutional. Ongoing cases in federal and state courts are being thrown into doubt as judges try to figure out how this unanimous Supreme Court decision affects their pending matters. Plaintiffs who were losing are suddenly winning. Defendants who were facing prosecution are suddenly seeing charges dismissed. And the entire legal landscape has shifted overnight. Emergency meetings are happening right now in state attorneys' general offices across the country as legal teams try to assess the damage, figure out which regulations can be defended, and determine what legislative changes might be necessary. States like California, New York, New Jersey, Illinois, and Massachusetts, jurisdictions with the most extensive regulatory schemes in the areas touched by this ruling, are being affected first and most dramatically. Officials in these states are facing the reality that large portions of their legal frameworks may now be unconstitutional. Some states may attempt to resist the ruling, either by arguing that their specific laws are somehow different from what the Supreme Court addressed or by attempting emergency legislative patches that try to accomplish the same goals through different means. Now let's turn to the federal government and Department of Justice reaction, because the federal-level shakeup is every bit as dramatic as what's happening in the state. The DOJ and federal agencies are facing a massive legal shift that requires them to fundamentally reassess their enforcement strategies, their regulatory positions, and their constitutional compliance. Agencies like the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives now face serious questions about which rules they can enforce, what regulations survive constitutional scrutiny, and how they need to adjust their operations to comply with this unanimous Supreme Court decision. The legal arguments that the DOJ has been making in cases across the country, arguments defending broad regulatory authority, arguing for deference to agency expertise, or claiming that the government's interpretation of constitutional limits is reasonable, can no longer stand. When all 9 Supreme Court justices reject the government's position, those arguments are dead. Inside the federal bureaucracy, there's panic about what this means going forward. Officials are asking fundamental questions. What do we enforce now? which rules are suddenly unconstitutional and need to be suspended or revised. How do we comply with this decision while still accomplishing our policy goals? The answer to that last question is that if the policy goals conflict with the Constitution as interpreted by a unanimous Supreme Court, the policy goals have to change. Let's explore what this ruling means for future cases, because the ripple effects on major ongoing legal battles are enormous. This decision doesn't exist in isolation. It establishes principles, creates precedents, and provides legal ammunition that will be used in countless future cases. Attorneys across the country representing plaintiffs in cases involving Second Amendment restrictions, licensing schemes, ban categories, and state-level regulations are already revising their briefs and filing new motions that cite this 9-0 ruling. They're arguing that the same constitutional principles the Supreme Court just unanimously applied in this case also apply to the restrictions they're challenging. And courts are going to have a very hard time disagreeing when the Supreme Court has spoken so clearly. This decision ties directly into future lawsuits that are currently working through the federal court system. Cases that might have been decided in favor of the government before this ruling will now be decided differently because the legal framework has changed. Judges now have less room to interpret constitutional protections narrowly or to find ways to uphold government restrictions that don't clearly satisfy constitutional requirements. The Supreme Court has tightened the boundaries, made the test more rigorous, and shown that they're willing to strike down government actions unanimously when those actions violate fundamental rights. Now let's connect this ruling to everyday Americans and explain how it impacts your daily life, because this decision has real-world consequences that go far beyond courtrooms and legal theories. Depending on the specific rights and restrictions involved in this case, the practical effects could include easier access to constitutional rights that were previously burdened by regulations the court just struck down. Restrictions that made it difficult, expensive, or time-consuming to exercise those rights are suddenly lightened or eliminated entirely. Bureaucratic hurdles that served no legitimate purpose beyond discouraging people from exercising their rights are collapsing under the weight of this unanimous Supreme Court decision. Law enforcement agencies and regulatory bodies must change their operations immediately to comply with the new constitutional standard. Officers can no longer enforce rules that the Supreme Court has declared unconstitutional. Agencies can no longer impose requirements that violate the principles this decision establishes. For travelers, for military families, for residents of states with strict regulations, and for anyone who has felt that their constitutional rights were being unfairly burdened, this ruling provides immediate protections. Let me close by forecasting what happens next and issuing a warning about the battles still to come. This unanimous ruling is a massive victory for constitutional rights, but it's not the end of the fight. Legal battles are already forming on the horizon. We're going to see emergency appeals from states and government agencies trying to limit the scope of this decision or to argue that their specific regulations are somehow different enough to survive. We're going to see state resistance, with some jurisdictions openly defying the Supreme Court or dragging their feet on compliance. We're going to see DOJ adjustments as the federal government tries to figure out how to operate within the new constitutional boundaries the court just established. And we're going to see rapid-fire lawsuits filed by civil rights organizations and individual plaintiffs challenging every law and regulation that's based on the same flawed reasoning the Supreme Court just unanimously rejected. Although this ruling is a victory for constitutional rights, opponents of those rights will attempt new strategies to accomplish through different means what the court said they cannot do directly. Legislatures will pass new laws with different language. Agencies will issue new regulations claiming they're consistent with the Supreme Court's decision. And activists will pressure officials to find ways to preserve restrictions that the court's reasoning clearly calls into question. This ruling will shape America for decades. It will be cited in thousands of cases. It will be taught in law schools. It will influence how government officials think about the limits of their power. and it will protect the rights of millions of Americans who might otherwise have seen those rights eroded by government overreach. A 9-0 ruling from the Supreme Court is not a suggestion, it's a constitutional reset. It's the highest court in the land speaking with absolute unanimity about fundamental principles that bind every level of government. And the shockwave from this decision is only beginning. Subscribe so you don't miss the next major development as this plays out. Drop a comment telling me how you think this ruling affects your state and your rights, and I'll see you in the next one.